Chapter 14 Cargo Bay 13 The greatest sin in the Rhodeshi people's eyes is tedium. It is precisely that critique which they level at existence. Better to be bleeding out in a battlefield than to be bored, or rather, better watch someone else bleed out. They wish to infuse every moment of their lives with entertainment, with drama, and in doing so, become something greater than their comically short lifespans. As such, my boring childhood under the Mansa, my existence, was considered a tragic abomination. To hear that Chiron preferred me anyway, well, that was one of many nuances to the insult seethed after the fact. It is a strange idea to me, however, that there are many moments in my life one would consider profoundly tedious. Not every second was spent gallivanting across the galaxy or sieging worlds or even filled with heart-rending tragedy, as surprising as that may seem. In fact, most of my life has been spent in those moments the galaxy would label as monotonous, something I was well adjusted to. Just in this short introduction to my journey, which so far would not constitute a day's attention, I have omitted weeks of uneventful detail. I have not included most of English's early lessons, many of which were frustratingly slow. I did not recount Ailion disciplining me for not keeping my quarters clean, something he later remarked as impressive since I had no possessions. And I did not mention much of my early interactions with Riker and Kybet. I was introduced to them right away, but there was no point in wasting words over such a short and distant conversation. And yet, despite this life of abject dullness, as Oberyn would have put it, the galaxy shall measure his life in the dates and days of mine. And the Rhodeshi people, after all their great games were said and done, their memory begins with me. I stared for many hours out of the viewport in my quarters, watching the ships go by in the orbit of Rhodon. I could have watched for hours more. Many times it was only the sharp need for food or water which drove me away from the chance to see something new. But this time, however, I found myself unsatisfied for the opposite reason. Everything out there was the same. That's something you find out about pleasure cruises. They are all identical to the last. Getting up, I opened the door and began yet another expedition out into the Ailion. Thankfully, instead of just locking me in, Ailion had finally decided on a sensor for the door. It alerted Kybet whenever I left the room, and she could run a background algorithm to track my movements on the ship. Despite this system, which worked well enough for Ailion, English would usually appear not 5 minutes later. This was something I was initially very annoyed by, and only later in years astounded. This time, however, I was left to my own devices as I wandered the corridors of the Ailion. Always marking my trail, always inching my way forward, there was not a single hall left unmapped by my crude directions by the time I was done. I scratched arrows on the walls. I unwound lines of spare cable. I placed boxes on top of one another to count the decks. And when that quickly failed, I turned to a notation system of dashes and dots. English was the first to find out about this, of course, and she gave me a data slate with a map to navigate the ship. I kept to my system anyway, hiding my ever more complex symbols behind cargo crates and hull panels. And it so happened that the map English gave me was inaccurate anyway. It was correct in the general placement of things, yes, but in the corridors, in the niches, in the hidden spots of the Ailion, there were more secret compartments in this ship than a smuggler could ever ask for. And this included the entirety of the non-existent Cargo Bay 13, which sat inconspicuously where the ship's mainframe was supposed to be. A total of 3 decks tall and enough open space to house a hangar of shuttlecraft, Ailion kept the bay in total darkness. You had to bring your own light inside, otherwise you would lose yourself. The walls were made of a dense hydrous polymer material, as a standard for most spaceship mainframes. The cargo bay was meant to be totally invisible to sensors, off all circuit mapping, as is the usual for those highly radioactive areas. No one would think to question that the Ailion might not have such a computer, nor why it did not need one. But even as observant as I wouldn't have noticed the entrance if Ailion had not left the door open. The hull panels suddenly had a gap, and peering inside, I saw the impossibly large chamber for such an indiscreet entry. I saw Aemon in the long distance. He had set a glow orb at his feet, and he was sitting on a crate with his back towards me. It was a minor miracle I could see him at all. To call Cargo Bay 13 cluttered would be an understatement. The only thing on this ship more disorganized would have been the 6.5 centuries of memory that oppressed Aemon wherever he went. And this room itself was only one small corner of the man. I truly do not know where to begin with Cargo Bay 13. There were at least 100 flash-fossilized heads mounted on the wall, most of them ferocious animals from various planets. Although, there were also a few from the more memorable of Aemon's bounties as well. The skulls were accompanied by paintings, bas-reliefs, and data murals, some recovered from the war, some payment for Aemon's services, and some simply stolen back. I noticed a tapestry that looked similar to the one in Ingrish's room, though it was too dark for me to make out what was on it. I wish I could put together a full list, but there was so much that defied category, so much that could not simply be put on a mere inventory. There were diluvial dream catchers, glass star maps, and curated rows of azaled teeth, still growing decades after being plucked from the flower's maw. And as I picked my way through the dark room, there was so much silhouetted in the pitch black. I saw heaps of books. Books, not data slates. They were written in half a dozen lost languages. Some were written and encoded by Aemon himself, but most were souvenirs taken from extinct species. There were crates of Jakatan jewelry, their light shining like dim stars in the dark space. I saw canisters of green fluid, liquid calculators, churning slowly in their deactivated resting states. There were cephalopodic pipe organs, scaly headdresses from the Utuscan dynasties, and microfibrous sculptures. I saw holoschematics taken from the end of the Fifth Aberrant War, casks of whiskey from planets now turned to cinder, gravestones piled from tomb worlds, and more than a few monoliths now rendered inert. I saw automatic translocators, Terran gas rifles, and even chits housing digitized antimatter meant to instantly construct and then totally obliterate the target. And then there were also the things that Aemon grieved over, more than the rest. An occupied stasis pod, a scorched scrap of hull plate, and a sheathed zero sword. There were no other words to describe this room except as a heap of spent time, slowly collected over the centuries. Cargo Bay 13 might have been one of the best-kept secrets in the galaxy, and if you wonder why Aemon so rarely leveraged the contents of this room, so rarely utilized this great arsenal, then you don't understand the man. Ghosts were as dear to him, if not more so, than the living. I used to be very angry at him for that, but after you live as long as we do, the ghosts become more real than those who are still living. They're the only ones who stay with you. I watched Aemon from behind a cargo crate, sure that he had not spotted me. He was hunched over a book, scribbling with a pen. I waited there a long time, far longer than any normal child ought to have been able to. The only noise in the room was scribbling, and then Aemon straightened. He snapped the book shut, and without turning to me, he said, "Come here, Vass." Silently, I rounded the cargo crate and approached. Standing in front of Aemon, his weathered face was dimly lit by the yellow glow orb. The old man sized me up. "Ingrish crying today." My throat clenched, but Aemon waved his hand dismissively, already knowing my worry. "Wasn't you, Oberyn."
"I don't understand."
"She hurts, for what you overheard." I stared, unblinking at the word. Aemon sighed. "For your future. She hates Oberyn. I hate him. Don't think him. Don't learn him."
"Why?"
"She loves you," Aemon said stoically. His eyes glanced away from me into the darkness, peering at something I could not guess at. He stared for a long time before lowering his head. With a trembling hand, he covered his mouth, concealing some secret that only he knew. And then, with an expression of great agony, the only emotion I then recognized on faces, Aemon said, "I love you." I didn't know what to think. Amon couldn't say those words, not the way English could. I suppose that is the drawback of growing up with a telepath for a mother. You come to expect an intimacy that no one else in the galaxy can express to you. Amon could never impart to me 1,000th of what English could share without a spoken word. But then again, it was also true that English could not speak one syllable from Amon's mouth. And as I stand here, gazing over a murdered star, I realize that I have forgotten much of what English has said to me over the years. But from Amon, not a single word. However, I can't say I had any sense of that at the time.
Can I leave?
I asked suddenly, driven away more by the fact that I just didn't understand Amon. The old man slowly nodded, but just as I turned, he called out, "Wait." I glanced back. Amon stood up, towering over me. "What did you take?" I held out my palm. It wasn't that I meant to steal anything. It was that I needed something to track my way back here, and I simply chose the most apparent object convenient to me. It was one of the few items not covered in a thick layer of dust in the cargo bay. A silver cruciform bound by a chain necklace. It had been resting on the stasis pod just near the entrance. Amon reached out his hand and bid me place the necklace in his palm. I obeyed without hesitation. He inspected the trinket for a long while, running it along in his hands. Finally, he stood up and placed it around my neck. "We are not alone," he said. And just as the same, he could never say those words with the same tenderness or feeling that English had. Nor could he make the moment the same as it had been in the access tube. However, as I realized, the whole conversation he had with me could not have been spoken without many tedious hours. He would have had to sit with English for a great deal of time, carefully memorizing every narrow meaning I knew. And it was all just so he could speak with me face to face, without an interpreter. He did as much, knowing that those words meant nothing, not a single thing, except that they were the most important words to me. And they just so happened to be the most important words for him as well. He was to undergo surgery tomorrow, and it was that he would not be able to speak until after the carapace suit was taken off again. Until after it was all over.
"The Dalvain told you this armor was an antique, yes?"
Tot asked, examining one of the ocular nails with the hand scanner. Amon crossed his arms. He was wearing thin, loose clothes in preparation for the surgery. "Let me guess," he said. "The armor is not in the best condition." Tot set the implant down onto a nearby tray.
"As far as my inspection goes, the gravity shielding is completely disabled. Ion emitters are at 5% efficiency, so don't expect much protection from some of the higher-end plasma weaponry. Short-range teleporter is 1 to 2 charges left, and then that will go too. You'll be relying entirely on the armor's raw plating and regenerative capabilities. Speaking of which, the nanofabricator is 83% depleted. I do not recommend taking much damage, otherwise we will not be able to take the suit off without killing you."
"So, it will be just like old times," Amon sighed. He glanced at me. "Corpse armor. You know why we called it that? Keeps you fighting even after you're dead. No heartbeat, no breathing, no brain. You don't get to die until you bleed every last drop and then some." The old man continued talking. I would have listened more, but English politely put her hands over my ears and refused to translate. Amon's mouth moved, and he seemed to be staring at something 1,000 miles away. When he did finally glance back, he let out a wry smile and shook his head. Looking over to Tut, he motioned that he was ready. He jumped off the bed and the two went into the surgery suite where all the scalpels and saws and needles were ready for their grisly work. Amon marched up to the bed and laid down while English and I watched behind the reinforced glass.
"One last thing,"
I heard English translate Amon's voice as he stared up at the butcher's instruments.
"Have you begun teaching vast history yet?"
You're asking now?
English looked at him worried.
"Might as well,"
Ammon said as Tut gave him a shot of anesthesia in his arm.
"Kid, if you're hearing me, listen closely. You're not going to learn this from a data slate.
If you want to know how bad the war was, how desperate we were, how much we sacrificed for this galaxy, don't look away. Aemon closed his eyes, and the very words English translated were this, a final order to the doctor. Don't let me dream. Depending on the generation, a carapace suit can take anywhere from a few days to several weeks to put on. For Aemon, he wouldn't wake until the start of the games. I suppose English could have ordered me out of the medical bay, spared me what I was about to see. He would have saved me a few nightmares. But I think she knew Aemon needed me there, that in whatever part of mind that was still aware during the surgery, he needed a reason to hold himself together. He needed a reason to fight, even as the Rodeshi dragged him right back into the hell of the Fifth Aberrant War, the hell of wearing that armor. And as I look back, I realize Aemon was never trying to save humanity. He was not that kind of man to take up lost causes. He didn't care one whit about some embryos that would have had to have been grown in vats. No, the reason he allowed himself to be gutted, without a single complaint, was that he was trying to save my future, spare me from the life I was going to live once he was gone. Whatever flaws Aemon Russ had, whatever blame you can assign the man, he never hesitated to sacrifice himself for another. And so he walked to that butcher's table for the sake of a child who had no notion what he was trying to do. The surgery begins with the installation of the ocular nails. Long, thick spikes. The black implants were sharpened to a point and studded with monofilament wires. They were slowly driven through the eyes until the ends poked through the back of the head. This would take up to 6 hours as the monofilaments embedded themselves into Aemon's brain and restructured his nervous system, preparing his mind and body for the more severe modifications. Portions of Aemon's psyche had to be sectioned off, lest he go insane upon waking. The man's own emotions, the amygdala, among other parts of the brain, were scanned, saved, and cauterized. By the end of the first stage, his eyes were gone, replaced by black orbs prickling with red light. The next part was the attachment of the exterior vertebral column. Each individual piece was drilled into Aemon's spine, with thin tubes inserted down the length of his body. Black, viscous fluid was pumped in, the nanites quickly getting to work restructuring Aemon's cellular functions and isolating his nervous system from his organs. These tubes would be removed later, after the metal vertebrae had fused with Aemon's spine. Once the man's brain had been effectively rendered independent of his bodily functions, Tut got to work. Opening up Aemon's torso, the doctor hollowed out most of his insides. He took out Aemon's heart and stitched the nanofabricator to the artificial veins growing inside the blackened cavity. His stomach and intestines were replaced with a pouch about the size of my fist. The rest of the space was filled with much of the technology Tut had talked about earlier, directly integrated into Aemon's body. I believe the lungs were the only thing not carved out. They didn't have the part for it, so they let the nanites break down and convert the organ into its much smaller and efficient replacement. There was a long while where Aemon simply looked like a corpse on the medical table, with everything essential to keep a human alive placed in a box. And yet, he was still breathing. By the time Tut closed Aemon back up, the man's skin was pale white with dark ports erupted from his flesh. I was glad I couldn't make out much of the next part, as the nanites reinforced his skin and changed his bones into metal. His very muscles and tendons were re-threaded. By the time Tut was affixing the exoskeleton plates, there was not one part of Aemon's body that had not been thoroughly violated. Bit by bit, Aemon was hidden under black armor plates. Long needles slid into the ports where blackened blood would be pumped in between the layers of the ultra-strong armor, fusing flesh and metal. Finally came the helm, a bulky mask with a long tube to be inserted down Aemon's esophagus. And then Aemon was gone, replaced entirely by this new thing that was the carapace suit. After weeks of surgery, we were there for that moment when the man utterly disappeared. Tut stepped back and announced to the room,
Perfect.
English broke down and wept. And for myself, I simply obeyed what Aemon had told me. I watched as much as I could bear to see.